1, 2, 3.
Military budgets are skyrocketing across the globe, while funding for social needs, housing, healthcare, education is being slashed. Politicians often justify this skewed spending by claiming it creates jobs. But what if the people doing those jobs had a say in how public money was used? 50 years ago, workers at Lucas Aerospace, a UK military contractor, designed a visionary proposal known as the Lucas Plan, a worker-led alternative focused on socially useful production rather than weapons of war. In our special report, The Lucas Plan at 50, A Radical Investment in Society, Not the War Machine, available now as a podcast, Laura spoke with Hilary Wainwright, co-author of The Lucas Plan, A New Trade Unionism in the Making, and co-editor of Red Pepper magazine. Hilary is one of the voices behind that groundbreaking effort. What follows is the full Uncut conversation with Hilary, rich with lessons for today's movements for climate justice, peace, and economic democracy. Also available in this podcast feed is the Uncut conversation with Brian Salisbury, a former Lucas Aerospace shop steward and one of the voices also behind that groundbreaking effort. Now here's the full Uncut conversation between Laura and Hilary Wainwright.
Yay, Hilary, thank you so much for taking time. I'm so glad to be here with you.
Well, it's a pleasure.
Beautiful home. You got involved with the Lucas Aerospace workers when you were pretty young. Do you remember how it happened and what those days felt like in the early 70s?
Yes, I mean, I was a very radical socialist as a result of being involved in the movements around 68 and the Vietnam War. And part of that was a belief that although I'd been active as a student and then very much as a feminist, and I believed in both movements and their capacity to bring about change, I also always believed, I suppose influenced by Marxism, that the working class had the capacity, the knowledge, not only to resist, but to create an alternative economy, you know, so that their involvement was key. And how to achieve that was a question of strategy, but also just day-to-day practice. So I joined political organisations that were about, you know, a strategy towards the working class. But I found by being living in Newcastle, and I worked in Durham, and that was a very industrial context. Well, Newcastle was, or Newcastle, and so in a way, working with shop stewards and shop floor workers was practical. It didn't. I mean, I don't want to denigrate theory and strategy, but I just had relationships with them in the course of building a sort of united left in Newcastle. And how I got involved with the Lucas shop stewards was the result of being involved with shop stewards in a company called Vickers, which I don't know that it's got a US backed, but anyway, it was a big arms company, you know, came from a very imperial sort of arms company in the turn of the century, in the early 20th century, and it made tanks and other military equipment, and it still did in the 1970s. And I was as part of a sort of sociology of labour project, interviewing workers in the tank factory in down the Scotswood Road, a factory called Elsick, and I was interviewing them about some sociological question about why workers demand what they demand in terms of wages. And I was interviewing this very canny shop steward, and he was getting a bit bored with my questions, you know, as was I. And he said, "Look, Hilary, why don't you, don't work for the university, work for us. I mean, you could be paid for by the university, but come and work with the Combine Committee." They were building by a Combine Committee, I mean a committee that brings together shop stewards from different factories in a big multinational company. These companies had only recently become multinational companies. They had been very successful on the back of Britain's sort of economic domination, but were beginning to face cutbacks, competition. I mean, the companies were facing competition, and their response was to cut back on labour. And the response of the unions, at least at a shop floor level, was actually the unions nationally, the big bureaucracies, were not adequate to deal with these companies. Neither were, shop stewards committees in any one particular factory. They needed to come together across the company and develop a strategy for confronting the company. So they basically not employed me, but they took me on as a volunteer to kind of go around the factories and find out the different conditions, the different problems, and then I'd write it up and present it to the next Combine Committee. And then there was an organisation, a very impressive organisation that's maybe relevant to today, which brought together these shop stewards committees across, not just across engineering, but across the whole economy, but particularly across engineering. And it was called the Institute of Workers' Control. And they would have these meetings in Nottingham. And so the Vickers Shop Stewards Committee would go, and so would the Lucas Aerospace Shop Stewards Committee. And the Lucas Aerospace Shop Stewards Committee was a bit of a sort of, in the kind of advance guard. It had got the most coherent organisation developed. And then eventually, as redundancies and closures hit, the question became, how do we respond? Yeah. And the Lucas workers were the ones that had the alternative, a plan, and that influenced the Vickers workers. And then, finally, in this rather long-winded story, the Lucas workers, who were very clever at sort of getting public money, they felt that money belonged to them as citizens, and they found a fund that funded research that was defined by a non-academic body, and then they would employ an academic. So they got the money, defined the problem as being the problems of the trade union bureaucracy and the inadequacy of the trade union movement for dealing with these questions of redundancies and closures. And then they employed me and Dave Elliott from the Open University to research with them.
And did you feel right away this is something different, this is something new, something is happening here that you haven't seen before?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I suppose I'd seen the development of a Combine Committee before, of shop stewards coming together. The Lucas Shop Stewards Combine Committee was particularly sort of self-conscious in the sense of very worked out, very, trying to create new procedures all the time, appropriate to the conditions they were working in. So that process was very new. And as a feminist, and there were other women involved, not as Lucas workers, but as researchers or helping in some way. And we were struck by how similar the methodology of the two movements were, that both were very concerned about process democratic, but not just in a formal way, but a way that made them responsive to their members, and therefore in a way more powerful because the members related to the organisation and identified with it and acted together with it. And the Combine Committee had that sort of self-consciousness about how it related to the members, how far it was able to listen to the members and convince the members.
One thing we should probably clarify is what a shop steward actually is.
So
what's a shop steward?
A shop steward is literally a leader of workers on the shop floor, or also the office floor, because unionisation spread, to offices, design rooms and so on. So basically, the workers in a particular factory, or even department of a factory, because a shop is, I'm no expert at this, but a shop refers to a department, almost like, if we were making a particular component in this room, we'd be a shop, and there'd be other shops. So the shop stewards would be the leader of that particular group of workers, elected by them and accountable to them, and also the person who, if management was being particularly shitty, the shop steward, the workers would get the shop steward to come, and deal with it. So often the shop stewards had to deal with problems on the spot. and stop. They would sometimes, you know, in a car factory, they'd stop the line. So they had considerable authority and had to have earned that by being a respected leader and an elected leader. And then the shop stewards would, of the different factory floors, or the different shops, would come together in a local shop stewards committee. So they were powerful people, and then there was a convener who convened the shop stewards, and he or she was a very powerful person. I mean, in some factories, like I think this Vickers Elsick, this might have been a boast of the convener, but they ran, they had a sense of running the factory because they could, you know, they had the power to stop production.
One of the things that your book lays out is just how many tactics the Lucas Aerospace workers had tried before they got to the point of creating an alternative corporate plan. What were some of the things they tried?
Yes, I mean, they did that. It definitely came out a lot that the plan was like the end result of seeing the limits, not the absolute limits, but the limitations of the tactics that were really tactics of refusal. So the strike, the withdrawal of labour, or the occupation, the kind of holding of the factory, and that wasn't quite enough, partly because it wasn't enough to convince the members. I mean, any effective action required the power of membership involvement and refusal or action. And you have to convince the members it's worth it. I mean, they're giving up money, you know, when they're taking strike action of any kind or occupying. The management is withholding their wages. So it's got to be worth it. And so the whole question of what's it for, you know, we're resisting, but any resistance presupposes the idea that things could be different. So what is it that we're actually organising for? And so that's one reason why the plan became an issue. I mean, the story of the plan is slightly different, but that's the sort of logic, you know, that other tactics only got so far but couldn't be sustained.
The other thing that seems so remarkable for us today is that instead of having a long list of issues that the organising committee, the Combine Committee, was addressing, they were instead pulling people together from lots of different places and shops around a common product. How significant was that? And maybe you would describe it differently. One of the issues that we have today is a divide, people with different interests and different agenda. How do they get around that?
I think partly it was historic that over the years they had addressed...
Would you agree that it was a problem often?
The disunity or the fragmentation, the fact people have got different needs, different priorities. Yes. I mean, it is. I suppose it's an inevitable problem because people's lives are different, circumstances are complex and combine in different ways. So people are facing, and people's lives are at different phases, and people's needs are different. So in different regions, wage rates are different, or the degrees of confidence are different. So there's all sorts of varieties which can then be used as divisions, and management can exploit that, and did, definitely. So that is an issue, and I think initially it was overcome by addressing all the different issues. So wage rates would be an issue at certain times. They built a lot of unity around pension schemes, which is a common question. You know, having a good, decent pension to look forward to, and having some control over that, and then also having some control over how that pension money is used. So they had a very strong pension campaign. I think another issue that was really important, looking back, was health and safety. So in any industrial process, you know, there are all sorts of health and safety problems of toxic, conditions in the environment and the factory floor, physical risks, you know, all sorts of things. So health and safety, which immediately brings you into the issue of technology and the kind of the fact that technology isn't all good and isn't all neutral, not all the white hot heat. You know, things can be very dark, very problematic. So that united people around thinking about technology and thinking critically about technology and thinking about science and working with technologists, working with people outside the factory. So that was important, that they developed a common recognition that a lot of their struggles needed some kind of outside support. So it wasn't considered weird to involve academics and experts.
So by the time they were meeting around the plan at Wortley Hall, they'd been through a lot.
Yeah.
What was that like? What were those meetings like in the 70s? Do you remember being there at Wortley Hall?
Yes, I mean, it was sort of strange because Wortley Hall had a decayed sort of grandeur. I mean, you know, you sort of have to imagine, I don't know if one's seen, I can't remember all the names of these fancy programmes, but you know, Jane Eyre, sort of, you know, classic English, and they're all filmed in these kind of mansions, so people in the US will probably have seen these films and seen, you know, I remember they had what we call bow windows, sort of, you know, that would look out onto very, you know, cultivated gardens, and even at Wortley Hall they did keep up the quality of the gardens and everything. So everything had a sort of era of a grandeur that had been, you know. So here were these shop stewards and me and other researchers sitting in these bow windows, and in these, again, the chairs all had this sort of decayed, you know, brocade and sort of ornate wood. Everything was slightly grand, but no longer overpoweringly grand, just faded grand, and quite comfortable, you know. So people would be lying back. Well, you know, you could if you wanted. So they had a sort of leisurely atmosphere, and it was chaired by this very astute, kind of quite elderly. Well, I mean, I was so young then, but now it wouldn't be elderly. He was probably younger than I am now. But shop steward called Ernie Scarborough, and he was a real character. You know, I can't imitate them, but and there was another one called Danny Conroy. But Ernie was very, very astute and had quite a good bullshit detector kind of antennae. And also, you know, the key thing about the Combine Committee was that all those people there, they were all representatives of their factories, but they were very accountable. They weren't representatives in the sense that they could decide, you know. So it wasn't like Parliament where MPs decide and have got a slightly, you know, they've almost got the reflected glamour of the crown. They sort of, they're the people that are important. But at the Combine Committee, you didn't feel they had a sense of their importance. They were reflecting the views of the members, and they knew that nothing that was decided at the Combine Committee could go ahead unless the members had agreed it. So they didn't have that sort of pretentiousness that sometimes representative committees have, that they are the deciders ultimately, because it wasn't them, it was the members. And so there was that sort of cautiousness and listening, you know, to each other, because they were listening to, well, you know, would the Willesden site, would they accept this or not? Would the Burnley site accept it or not? That's a very important site. You know, so they were all listening to each other out of not just politeness, but sort of strategic considerations for the effectiveness of the Combine as a whole. So that made it quite a both tense and sensitive meeting. It was quite impressive.
Do you remember Phil and Brian?
Yes, well, Phil was a key person in my life, because when I arrived or got this job with them, and I was introduced, and as I say, I wasn't like pretentiously young, I mean precociously young, but I was sort of a little bit younger. They were mostly middle-aged. They were all men, and but they were very respectful. I don't know about respectful, but they were sort of nicely paternalistic or avuncular. And so they decided that I needed a young liaison person, and they chose Phil. So I would often go to Phil's house in Burnley and work there, or chat to him endlessly. He probably got exceedingly bored.
And Brian?
And Brian, yes. Well, Brian, I think Brian was the chair. I mean, he was an important figure, partly because he came from Birmingham. I mean, Birmingham was the centre of the Lucas company, and there were several Lucas Aerospace factories there, and there was a big contingent of Birmingham shop stewards. They all had this Birmingham accent, which I can't imitate, but is distinctive. So Brian was a figure, and he's tall and sort of, a presence, so he was, I mean, each of them were incredible characters, actually.
There was also a newspaper, right?
Yes, I mean, that was one part of building the Combine. So they had this emphasis on communications, which in a way is it's sort of logical consequence of being so dependent on the members. So actually raising the consciousness of the members was key, and the newspaper was one. Posters, report backs, and then liaising between the different shop stewards in between meetings. So there was this very canny shop steward called Ron Mills, who sadly died, but he was the one that would liaise. So there'd be Ernie, who'd be the secretary, Brian, who was the chair, and then in between, it was almost like a sort of nervous system, So Ron would be in touch with all the different conveners of the different shop stewards committees in the different factories, and would report back to Ernie, well, this site's not sure or needs a bit of extra information, or, so it was a very active sort of system almost in between meetings.
And there was eventually a film, The Plan.
Yes, that was after. I mean, that's very well worth watching.
Hi, it's Laura. Independent media is a collaborative project, and you play a critical part in it. This show is made possible by our viewers and listeners, not corporations or advertisers. So join our member supporter honor roll by going to lauraflanders.org/donate to contribute. That's lauraflanders.org/donate. And please stay kind, stay curious, and commit to supporting this no ads, no gimmicks, not all about profit show, again, or for the very first time. Thank you.
And a reminder to hit that subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts. And thank you. Now back to our full Uncut conversation.
Coming to now, I mean, this was, how important would you say, Luke, this experience with the Lucas Aerospace workers was to you personally, as a person?
Well, I think for me personally, it was kind of both a vindication of my belief that change comes from, to use a phrase, the bottom up, the power of workers and working people without official state power or money, and that their collective strength and their collective capacity, their shared knowledge, is fundamental. And I sort of had believed that, since a kind of disillusion with Parliament and the existing political system. But the experience of the Lucas Plan gave it a kind of a detailed content, and particular things stood out. So one of the most important things that's influenced me, which I, in a way, is also brought out by the women's movement, is the importance of what we would call tacit knowledge, knowledge that isn't codified in books or documents or programs, but is tacit, is implicit. So in the case of the women's movement, the way that we would share experiences through consciousness-raising groups, and out of those consciousness-raising groups, which could be seen as, gossip, but reflective gossip, would come amazing policies that were really rooted in our needs and our knowledge of our needs. And similarly, the Lucas Plan, in a way, it came out of that tacit knowledge, that knowledge which is built into skill. Sometimes things we do but cannot tell, is the way Mike Cooley put it. So that sort of knowledge which was tapped by the plan, and that's why the plan had an emphasis on producing things. So it actually produced, examples of the products, prototypes, rather than just lots of verbiage. So I think that principle of a knowledge which is tacit and has to be built through sharing knowledge, which means building an organisation.
Well, moving to the current day, two questions there, I think, or maybe more than two, but one would be, do you think the conditions that gave rise to the Lucas plan were unique?
They were historically specific. I mean, but they were examples of a more general phenomenon, which is power, working class power, but it was power produced then by a bargaining strength which had been built up during the boom, when clearly it was in the interest of the company to get products out quickly because demand was booming, and that gave the shop stewards tremendous power. If they threatened to go on strike, management would give in. I mean, I'm not always saying automatically, but that there was a sort of, the strength was in the shop floor, which obviously it isn't now after kind of 50 years of attacks on trade union organisation and growing unemployment and so on. There's been a defeat. I mean, it's not been universal. I mean, there's some industries where, there's still considerable strength. I mean, and I suppose now there'll be strength within the military industry because the demand is being created. So there's still strength there, but it's not like it was. And so to some degree now, building the conditions under which workers can bargain over issues like product choice or technology, health and safety, requires building trade union organisations. So in a way, I mean, there's now a lot of talk about green bargaining. I mean, in a way, the Lucas plan now has become relevant because of the whole issue of climate change. And I think that's really important, because in the time of the Lucas plan, the issue was peace, was disarmament. This was after the, I suppose, it wasn't after the Cold War, but the Cold War was beginning to kind of weaken, and the peace movement was growing. So there was that combination of shop floor power on the one side, and then a demand for different products, different kind of industry on the other, coming from the peace movement against arms and the militarised economy. And now you've got a trade union movement that's fragmented and weak, but a very strong climate change movement, and that is leading trade unions to think we've got to do something about this. It's our children and grandchildren are going to suffer from climate change. How do we act as trade unions, and how do we then strengthen ourselves? So all the kind of resistance to outsourcing and casualisation and all the things that have weakened the trade union movement are being brought back into discussion.
There was also a political opening at that moment that is unlike today.
Yes, because this happened, the Lucas plan happened at a time when there'd been a very strong movement. It was actually around the mining industry. There'd been, in a way, the Labour government of 74, 75, until Thatcher won in 79, that government had come to power on the back of the trade union movement, trade union strength. So there was a very strong kind of radical element within the Labour Party then, led by Tony Benn. And he happened to be in the Department of Industry. So he was absolutely at the point where the strength of the trade union movement hit the state and hit politics. And he, in a way, gave expression to that by approaching questions of industrial strategy, not by, going to management, which is the normal. Management and government have a very strong relationship in Britain. Companies are sort of in and out of the Department of Industry all the time. And so and not only did he want to talk to the trade unions, but he wanted to talk to the trade unions at the shop floor level who kind of knew about production and knew the alternatives. And that was very unusual, and actually it was seen as absolutely, kind of beyond the pale. So that from then on, Tony Benn was kind of smeared and attacked as being bonkers and, being, I don't know, just generally being kind of an enemy of the state sort of thing. But he brought the shop stewards in, and it was him that said, effectively, should I nationalise aerospace or the components part of aerospace? And that led them to think, what do we want? And okay, nationalisation could be a good thing, but it must be on our terms. What are our terms? And that led to the plan. And that's not, now there's not anything like that. There could be, there are people in the Labour Party like Jeremy Corbyn, like Zara Sultana. There's a group of left-wing, well, not leftish, left MPs who know the tradition of the Lucas Plan and who are sympathetic to it, but they're not in government. And that those in government, I think the last thing they'd look to would be involving the shop stewards, which would upset industry, and you can't, in their terms, the present government doesn't want to in any way upset industry.
So you've talked about the importance of your involvement to your life, but this has continued to be, the Lucas Plan has continued to have relevance today. Why? Why do you think? What's it speaking to today when, as you've just described, the conditions are actually quite different in many ways?
Yeah, I think today it's speaking to a feeling in movements, particularly the climate movement, that though the climate movement has had an impact, particularly the school students' movement has had an impact on awareness, they haven't been able to actually change things. And government, is not delivering. Companies are greenwashing and pretending, but not actually doing anything about high carbon emissions. So where is there the strength or the knowledge, the kind of, what are the alliances that need to be made? And there's a recognition that even if the trade union movement isn't like as strong as it was in the 70s, nevertheless, they are an important ally. And also it's really important in order to build that alliance, to counter the sort of opposition between jobs and climate change and action on climate change, and a green agenda, a low carbon economy. And so in a way there's an interest in the idea that actually workers themselves are able to and have got a historical precedent of developing low carbon products, low carbon alternatives. And so I found a lot that people want to hear about the Lucas Plan. And, because there are only 2 Lucas stewards left, I and others like Sam Mason from the PCS Union and others that are, knowledgeable and have done research about Lucas, are always asked to speak. And we had a workshop the other day in Leeds of people who are involved in this kind of work. And there is a kind of, I wouldn't call it a movement, but there's a strong network of people, academics, people in local trade union movements, the Green movement, all focused on this issue of what is called either a worker-led just transition or worker-led decarbonisation. So it's a concept which now is coming back, and with it the sort of curiosity about the detail of the Lucas Plan.
other thing that you emphasize in the very beginning of your book is that fear of war, of mass unemployment, of instability can sometimes feel overwhelming. And particularly I think in the US right now, people feel that they're up against extraordinary power with extraordinary money at a time of geopolitical change globally and a lot of instability at home. And I think they feel pretty powerless. So there's something about the Lucas plan to me that at least gives you a certain amount of courage. But maybe it's unrealistic.
Yes, I mean, I'm not necessarily a great defender of realism because, I mean, I suppose, but I never feel fazed when people say, oh, Hilary, you're so unrealistic. Because actually, what's realistic is a lot to do with what you think your power is. But you can sort of create self-fulfilling prophecies of defeat, but just by being passive. And actually, I think the Lucas plan and the women's movement both showed that you have power because there's so many features of the system that you hate that depend on your complicity. So it's obvious in the context of the women's movement where, our complicity as women in, domestic labour, washing up, looking after the kids, taking sole responsibility, it keeps the sort of male dominance going, keeps patriarchy going. And similarly with the arms industry or high carbon production, if the workers on whom that production system depends, I mean, management couldn't produce any of these amazing military or high carbon products with all their disastrous, damaging, destructive features. But the workers actually know how they work, and they also know the technology, and they know that technology could produce completely different things. And that's what the Lucas plan showed. I mean, they knew they had the power to strike, but through developing the plan, they and anybody who studies them knows that they have the power to create and in a way to then use their industrial power, their strike power, as it were, to back up the products of their creation. So actually, we could be producing this. When you're told, or when workers like at Rolls-Royce or other companies now are told they're redundant, they can say, actually, we're not redundant. We can produce, this kind of transport, which is incredibly useful for third world countries dealing with transport across mountains, or we can deal with, heat pumps now in Britain are like the solution, or seen as promoted as the solution to high carbon forms of heating. Well, heat pumps were part of the Lucas plan. So I think that sense of the power we have as the people on whom the system depends could be a source of hope. And so it's not unrealistic to think, how do we use that power?
You have a great quote from Mike Cooley, and that might be my last question, where he says, we're not in crisis, the economy's in crisis. Yeah. If you were to describe, do you think we're in crisis today? And if so, how would you sort of describe the contours of it?
Well, we clearly are. With Mike, I'd say I never identify with that we. They are in crisis. They're in multiple crises. They're in a kind of huge moral crisis, in supporting the Israeli government, to some degree against the will of many Israeli people, certainly many Jews who are in Britain at any rate, and I think in the US, on the demonstrations against, or in support of the Palestinians against the genocide. So there's a moral crisis. I suppose the fundamental crisis is the way that they're allowing all the kind of forces that are producing climate change to just continue, as if all these disasters, whether it's floods or winds or heat, all the kind of forces that are destroying people's lives, by their thousands, are not happening. So each each flood is kind of, oh my God, terrible crisis, but not, it's actually a crisis we could be stopping by taking action. So the system, if you like, and it's useful to say there's a system because we need to identify it and see how it works and how it can be overthrown and what power we have, what leverage we have to overthrow it. The system is in crisis, but we, we as people, we're victims of that crisis. But we have different ideas. We've got alternative sort of visions, if you like. But also we've got relationships, and those relationships can be turned into forms of organisation which can refuse to let this system continue. I mean, the school student strike, the Greta Thunberg, it's classic. She just said, I'm not going to let this happen. I'm going to refuse to go to school and ask other school kids to join me. And so that example, it's a bit like the women at Greenham Common, where there was these cruise missiles based in Britain, in US bases in Britain. And these housewives, meaning women who weren't particularly powerful or working even, decided, we can't let this happen. So they marched to that site and they embraced it and they acted against, protested. And the end result was a movement that led to those missiles being, stopped, being banned, being taken away back to the US. Anyway, so
Lucas Plan was another example.
Yes, it was. I mean, it did have some effect too. It did save the jobs because people were convinced by it and refused to give in. So they carried on fighting, and that led to the jobs being saved. And the alternative products didn't get made by Lucas, but we can see them now. Like the heat pump is now very necessary and recognised as such. And if Lucas had made the shift,
Electric cars. The final question for you in a way is, you have spent many years, as have I, following social movements that have had mixed results on the face of it. Lucas, as you point out, wasn't accepted by the corporation, didn't actually get to go into effect, but it had a long life. How's your life been doing this work? How do you feel about it? Do you encourage people? Has this been a good life?
Yeah, I mean...
Are you glad you got invited into those
Wortley Hall meetings? Very glad, yeah. No, definitely. Because, oh my God, this is such a kind of existential question. So, yeah, I mean, partly you meet amazing people, but amazing because they're bringing about change, in systems that are otherwise going to completely not only depress you every day, but also literally physically destroy your lives and lives of your children, or the children of the future. So I mean, it means that there's daily hope in your life, and it sets you on a sort of life path that, there are often times when I get invited to meetings. I don't feel there's so much now, but I did when I was in Manchester, where it always rained, and I'd be invited to meetings, and I'd, by lunchtime, and I knew I had to, go to some town outside Manchester, and it was pouring with rain, and you think, oh my God, do I really, have to go? What excuse could I give? But you'd go, and then you'd be really enthused because people there would have, they'd have all sorts of ideas about what they could do in Bolton or Burnley or wherever it was, and you came back, sort of enlivened by that experience. And so, in a way, a life of being involved in social movements is full of not just pleasures in the sense of, conviviality and collective, what Lynn Siegel calls collective happiness, radical happiness, but also a sort of sense of renewed purpose, and the idea that that purpose has got an effect. You can actually change society. And there is an idea, I think it was one of your founding fathers, maybe Jefferson, talked about this idea of public happiness. And I mean, I can't remember exactly what he meant. And then Hannah Arendt also talked about public happiness. And I think that's what a life in social movements brings, a sort of, you could say it's a public happiness, but you're part of that public, so it's a private happiness as well.
Beautiful. I think that's great. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this full Uncut conversation. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters. Please join our members now by making a one-time donation at lauraflanders.org/donate. Or make it monthly. Go to patreon.com/Laura Flanders and Friends. That's also where you'll find more information on this conversation in the episode notes posted. That's patreon.com/Laura Flanders and Friends. And thanks again to all our member supporters.